But the interesting thing here was the existing cottage was almost wedged in this ideal location among the stones, but there wasn't a lot of room to move in any direction except this particular diagonal way back. So really a new footprint was kind of out of the question. And although there would be costs incurred, we decided to work with the site the way it was.
You're listening to Build the Unbuildable, a podcast about designing dream cottages on some of the most challenging sites in Ontario's cottage country. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Build the Unbuildable, a podcast about building high-end homes in impossible places. My name is John Tyreman, and as always, I'm joined by James Pitropov. James, how you doing?
Pretty good, John. How are you today?
I'm doing well, and I'm eager to learn more about building lakeside cottages.
This is going to be great.
So today we are tackling the question, to renovate or not to renovate. What is the kind of the thought process that goes into renovating an existing cottage on a lakeside or tearing it down and building completely anew? That's kind of what we're going to dig into today. So we'll talk about, what to consider before you do demo, why some older structures are more valuable than they may seem. And then we have a story from a past project that offers a really good example of kind of balancing renovation and building a new structure. So when clients come to you and they have a question in their mind, should I renovate or should I tear down my existing cottage? What are some of the big considerations that folks might think of?
Well, John, it's the million-dollar question, and it's on a lot of homeowners, cottage owners, clients' minds. The big question is what we have, is it valuable enough to develop further? Should we upgrade? In a lot of cases, people need more space. Sometimes life conditions change. They have parents coming back to live with them. They may have a new group of friends. They're entertaining more or less. Kids are moving out. They're going off to college or university, or they're coming back. So the way clients use their place can work in different ways. And as you know, John, I'm a registered architect. My firm is Lakeside Architecture, and we are focused on meaningful, beautiful custom architecture on lakes. And we are very client focused. So really, we're here to develop architecture that clients feel attached to. So the first question is, do we build or do we build new? Existing buildings, a lot of cases, clients will be very attached to them. In many cases, they've been a family cottage for generations. Sometimes family members have physically built the place, or they've been on a point for a very long time. Family history, a lot of great memories. And there just comes a time when it's just not enough space. What I found is we need to balance a sentimental attachment to what we have, which is great. I'm all for that, and I strongly promote those values. At the same time, we need to balance it against the limitations of an existing cottage. So one of the first things we'll do is I'll go to a site with the clients and just determine how structurally sound is a cottage. In some cases, you might be surprised, a grand old cottage, several thousand square feet, and they're just literally on blocks. They're sort of hanging together, John, by paint and drywall nails and all of that. Like they're just, might be a bit of an exaggeration, but there's a lot of work to be done. I like to poke around a little bit, get underneath, open the walls, see how far apart the joists are, how close we are to the ground, is there a functioning septic system, the heating systems, and so on. The problem, John, that comes up with a lot of places is that they were built as summer cottages, and they would, quite literally, you would shut down in the fall and drain your plumbing, so your pipes wouldn't burst in the winter by freezing. There wasn't a lot of insulation. They're not very rugged. And there is a lot of work to bring a cottage built to those standards up to today's standards, where a lot of clients, they're selling their homes in the cities, they are retiring up in cottage country, and now with wireless access, and a lot of professionals are working from from home, they're working remotely. They need a place that is comfortable in all seasons, isn't
Right.
humid, doesn't have drafts, isn't overrun by rodents, so the standards are higher.
This is really interesting, James. Let me ask you a quick question. I'm really curious of the folks that come to you with this challenge or with this kind of, do I renovate or do I build something new? How many of them has the cottage been in their family versus how many of them are buying an existing cottage and then talking to you?
I would say the breakdown is probably 80% of cottagers have a family history of cottaging,
Interesting.
if not more. There aren't a lot of new break-in cottagers. There are some though, and typically they'll go with smaller, very modern places that are quite interesting, almost like studios on some of the lakes. Really fun projects. The cottagers that have been on the lakes and have a family history of being cottagers have a lot of memories invested in their properties. And in some cases, they've gone on and they've built in the city, and at some point, they come back and they want to build something typically for their entire family, meaning their adult kids, grandkids, friends. A lot of times they like to have visitors and so on. So there is a lot of sentimental attachment. The question is, how far is it feasible to renovate to achieve what you want to achieve for your family aesthetically, for your family in terms of what makes sense for your particular budget, before you're putting in too much money, fixing, repairing, renewing, and you're not getting enough benefit out of the build. That is a big question that comes up with a lot of clients that we get inquiries from.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like there's a few different challenges layered together. You mentioned like distributed workforces and people being able to work remotely, and that's kind of opened up new locations for teleworkers, folks working remotely from the lake in the wintertime, perhaps. And so I guess you've got that, but then you also have this during peak lake season, having multiple family members coming in and needing the space to be big enough for extended family and everything in between. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, that's correct, John. And an additional challenge is this. As we all move on, in a lot of cases, clients, they're inheriting properties from their families. And the regulations are changing on the lakes. And some examples of the regulations that are changing are, it's getting harder and harder to build a boathouse on the lake. So if you have an existing boathouse, you must never tear it down hoping that you'll get approval to rebuild, because in a lot of cases you may not be able to. So we try to grandfather in new construction over existing footprints. It minimizes the perceived impact on the lake that municipalities are against, that lake associations don't like. They want to minimize new development. However, if we can build over existing footprints, you can retain those 20, 30 foot setbacks from the water that a generation ago or 2 generations ago were common. Now you've got to be back at least 100 feet. Septic needs to be back. There's more regulation. Ministry of Natural Resources approvals are becoming necessary in some areas on the Trent Severn system, among other waterways. Parks Canada might be involved, and these regulations are changing, John. So sometimes there's a race to get approvals and appropriate approvals before the window on regulations and bylaws changes.
I think that's a bombshell. I think that is a major reason why folks would want to consider renovating as opposed to tearing down and building anew, because of being grandfathered into some of those changing regulations.
John, you wouldn't believe when they came down hard on rebuilding boathouses on the lakes after municipality went under the pressure of lake associations lobbying the municipalities to slow down any sort of development on the lakes. I've always looked at boathouses and traditional construction as really appropriate on the lakes, and even modern construction can be appropriate depending on the scale and how things are laid out on the site. But there was a real push to finish boathouses, get them done. And that was a few years ago. Very hard to get boathouse approvals now, although we still get them. And now, with new changing regulations, people are wanting to check with the municipalities, what can they build, How much bigger can they build? Because 1,200 square feet is a little tight if you have three generations that want to use the property. Like sometimes it's a whole different social setting. It's not only generations. There's new types of families now. There's blended families. There's various sorts of partners and arrangements and various size groupings of people, even on one project. So that's a new consideration. And then again, the question is, which way do we go? We're taking the big step. We're doing the deep dive. And we know we've got to do something. Sometimes it's individual couples, partners, and so on. Sometimes it's siblings that need to work out arrangements that are feasible for them. So do we build over the existing? Do we renovate, or do we build new?
Can you give us some examples of either in the past clients who have been kind of caught off guard by certain regulations, or are there regulations that are pending right now that you see into the future as potentially changing the impact of either design or construction?
Well, I'll give you a couple of tough ones. Sure. One was on Lynx Lake, north of Huntsville. Beautiful little lake with some interesting geography around it. Cottage to be built out on a point, but it was a project there. And I'm going to compare that with a second project on a point, which was on Skeleton Lake, down near Bracebridge. Now, previously, to build on a point, you had to have a setback, and it came from one direction. Now the way the regulations have changed is that the setback comes from each side of the point, and you're left with hardly any land, if any at all, to build on. At the end of a long planning process of the two projects, one on Lynx Lake, which I believe is on the website, was approved, and one on Skeleton Lake, they just couldn't get the approval. They could get it, but it would have resulted in such a long, contorted plan. They just didn't go that direction. But what I did on the Lynx Lake is, instead of having one big footprint, we really wanted to retain that 20-foot original setback from all sides of the property. So what we did is we designed the cottage in pavilions separated by breezeways, staggered to follow the top of the rock outcrop, and it received its approvals. Well, that's one example there. Another example is on lakes such as Lake Joseph. Surprisingly, there are some boathouses and docks that extend quite a way into the water, and they'll go out like 100 feet, like at the north end of the lake. It's very rare on the lakes. Is still being approved, but it's to rebuild. It's being grandfathered on the grounds that there was always these extra long docks out there. I wouldn't rely on those regulations remaining in effect for a very long time. So for someone that is close to the water and is thinking about renovating or rebuilding, really in some ways the time is now. Got to start thinking about what you want to build and really knowing the regulations so that you can work with them, not being blindsided later and being told, well, the new setback is 120 feet, side yard setbacks, new setbacks for septic tanks, for wells and so on. Pretty much you're crowded off your property, and your property value has just dropped because you can't build on it anymore. So it's a huge risk.
And I guess that's why it pays to work with someone who specializes in lakefront properties. You've got a pretty firm grasp on those changing regulations, James.
Well, what I found is it's helpful to know what's been done on particular lakes and what the rationale was. And my rationale has always been to work with the site and produce good design. One tier of regulation that is above the individual municipality bylaws is the Ontario Planning Act. The basic requirements are, in most cases, is that you produce forms, buildings, and so on that are in scale with a property and do not diminish the lake views. Those regulations are there to maintain views. Municipalities in a lot of cases will think that means, well, that all buildings must be pushed back 150 feet away from the lake. You don't see them, and they minimize the impact. However, on some projects, such as a project that I did on Pencil Lake, pushing the building back from its pre-current 20-foot setback would put it back 100 feet, but it's going up a hill above the shoreline trees. It's really a worse scenario, and I'm sure the people on the lake wouldn't have wanted to have this big structure halfway down the steep hillside overlooking the lake. So we get those types of tough approvals. So the approvals are possible, and it is a big question on how close you want to be or how far you want to be away from the water as well. John, the next big issue that comes up is cost. And I'm sure this is on your mind as well. I know from our past conversations, this was interesting to you as well. The question is, do we get more bang for our buck renovating, or should we build new? Is the big question.
I suppose that's the answer to that question is probably it depends, right? Because it probably depends on the structural integrity of the existing cottage. How is it, like you mentioned, you like to go in and look underneath and look at the studs and the baseboards and the foundation of the cottage and try to get a real sense of that, because I only imagine, I mean, you tell me, the cost probably varies very widely.
Well, John, here's my sort of experience with things, and I've come up to some conclusions about renovating. Costs in cottage country can vary quite widely. The range for really high quality construction using authentic materials, Douglas fir, quarry stone, hemlock, all the beautiful materials. For my projects, it's ranged from about $400 a square foot. It can go up to $600 or $700 fairly quickly. So we try to be resourceful with the decisions that we make. And I find that there's a cutoff line. So when you go in and you renovate an existing structure, if it's on blocks, we've got to lift the cottage. We've got to put a new foundation underneath it typically. You have to insulate everything. If you're adding rooms above, you're tearing down walls. When you tear that wall down, John, there's going to be a bare spot in the floor and a gap that needs to be, do you just fill it in with new hardwood? You can't really do that. Does the addition have its own flooring, or do you tear up all of the existing? Then you've got to tear up your trims. If you're adding windows, you're going to change the cladding. How far do you go with it? A lot of times the little project scope, it expands. There's this creep in the scope, and little projects get big pretty quickly. So here's my experience is that if you're working on a project, really of any size, if you're getting into $250,000, $350,000, $500,000 plus on the reno, unless you have a really good reason to do it, you may be sinking a lot of money into the ground before you get anywhere near new exciting space. And by new and exciting, I mean, even practically speaking, are you adding bedrooms? Do you want to add 2 bedrooms? Do you want to add 3 bedrooms? How many bathrooms do you need now? Do you have adult children that are visiting? Do you have parents that have mobility issues? It's hard to get up the stairs. You build them a ramp. These all add the costs. So in a lot of cases, what I found is I'll start and we can explore different ideas. I mean, I work in 3D modeling. We get on with clients. We're on Zoom. We're working together so we can try different ideas. And also under my separate company, Lakeside Construction Management, unrelated to Lakeside Architecture, it's focused on cost and construction management. What we'll do is we'll take these designs from the architecture side and we will model the costs. And 9 times out of 10, when we look at it, it makes sense to rebuild. And by rebuilding, you're getting the additional spaces that you need. And then we can focus new construction, oriented better on the site, better views of the lake. Perhaps it's morning sunshine for the bedrooms if you like the morning sun. Walkouts. Sometimes people have noisy neighbors in cottage country. A lot of times we'll orient new garage. You can have rooms above, you can have a studio, you can have a workshop, you can store your snowmobiles in there. But you can create privacy by the layout of your building. When we build new, it's not just the building. I tend to build almost like in pavilions with breezeways in between them. We spread out on the land a little bit. We can capture a little bit of the land, and you get a lot of bang for your buck. It's going to cost more, but you get so much more space.
Okay. Awesome. Well, so our big question today that we wanted to tackle was, do I renovate or do I tear down my existing cottage and build a new? And so some of those key areas to consider is that kind of emotional value, that versus the functional value, the nostalgia that comes with, all the memories of going to the lake as a kid and trying to recreate that and keep that family lineage going. It sounds like the structural soundness of the building is a major point, especially in those early inspections. And then there's the evolving regulatory constraints and that cost analysis that needs to happen. So it sounds like those are some of the main points that we covered today. Is there anything that we didn't talk about before we turn to today's example in terms of considerations of renovating versus building new?
Well, now there are new considerations, there are new conditions and situations, environmental challenges, and new technologies that may suggest that building new is the way to go. And there are some examples that we can talk about.
All right, so James, let's turn now to our site story segment. For folks that are watching on YouTube, you can see all these examples are on lakesidearchitecture.ca. Go to the top menu and you go to Be Inspired, and you'll see all the different case examples and case stories in the Lakeside Architecture portfolio. James, the first view we have is this beautiful view of the Georgian Bay on this Killarney cottage. Can you walk us through this example?
Yeah, John, isn't that such a great shot there? All the abundant water and it's coming right up to the rocks there, and it looks idyllic. Well, this project is really interesting. It could be a case study on its own of taking the question of renovation versus new construction in dealing with some environmental changes. Now, that's a big claim, but I'll walk you and the listeners through this. So, this is a project on Georgian Bay in Killarney, not that far from Killarney Provincial Park. And this beautiful property is on a bay, and for years it had very consistent high water levels. And then, as some of your viewers may recall, if they live on Georgian Bay or have a cottage there or friends out there, the water levels just started to drop. Now, without mentioning any international neighbors or anything like that, there were concerns that water was being taken out of the lakes at the time, and also precipitation was falling. And this was at an alarming rate, so that each season, over several seasons, the shoreline on Georgian Bay was dropping. And this property was in an area of flat shelves of bedrock that were fairly shallow, so entire, like a half acre would disappear at a time. It just took a foot or two of water, and a lot of the site was diminished. So the owners, they had a bit of a dilemma, because they were concerned about water levels that could rise and fall, and things weren't consistent, and should they even sell the property. So at the time, we had a good hard look at the requirements of the municipality. Public health was involved, because there were old septic tanks on site. The property was close to wetlands and so forth. This property was interesting because at the heart of it was a vintage cottage with heavy timbers, stonework, and at the heart, though, the owners, interestingly enough, wanted something that was new, but wanted to start off, build from the existing, and they wanted to do it in stages. So their basic solution was to keep the original cottage, but to significantly renovate and expand it. Now, on previous podcasts, I extolled the virtues of building anew, of course. But the interesting thing here was the existing cottage was almost wedged in this ideal location among the stones there. But there wasn't a lot of room to move in any direction except this particular diagonal way back. So really a new footprint was kind of out of the question. And although there would be costs incurred, we decided to work with the site the way it was. You could almost call it a hybrid solution. And it helped spread the building out along the shoreline to make more use of a dry beach lagoon that had developed. So no longer was it the pure waterfront property. It was this dry beach lagoon with terraces. Basic solution, which I can get into in more depth, but was to retain a core which you'll see under the main body of the house, and then build out in stages, in steps, that would still be usable in case water levels ever came back up, which is a possibility. Since environmental conditions are not the same now, and the water level is not far. It's not that it's that far down below there. Once the water breaches each terrace, a whole half acre of shore gets flooded. So the idea was to step back the building, use the idea of adding, instead of partial renovation, more adding. Looks new, but really it's built in stages, stepping back up the terraces. So in that case, that hybrid approach really worked for the owners.
I love the way that it is terraced, and you can see that the buildings is kind of nested into those rocks that jut out to the waterfront there.
Yeah, John. The interesting thing about this project is that in a lot of cases, and you can you can test this by checking out the project on the website. In a lot of cases, the architecture tends to be very dramatic, and it's a big statement, and it speaks of the big A in architecture. Like everything is very almost over the top at times. The interesting thing here was that it's sort of the opposite of it, and it's sort of lower key in finishes and so on. But the takeaway for listeners would be, let's use creativity and think about the challenges on your own site. Make decisions on whether you build, rebuild, build in stages. Sometimes finances take apart. Sometimes I'll build structures in phases separated by breezeways and step them up the hill. You can do it in parts. And it resulted in some pretty interesting spaces. For example, thereafter they gutted the interior and they created a large common room. They preserved their Muskoka room. Now, I know some listeners are going to say, we call that a Kawarthas room. We call that a screen room. Down in the States, they'll call it the Adirondack room. Basically, the big screen room was preserved. A new wing was added with an entryway, a breezeway, a mudroom and a laundry, dining room and bedrooms. Overall, the feeling was open concept, but it's done in steps, like in stages, in discrete parts. Now, my challenge to listeners would be to consider their own projects, their own ideas, and to think about what phases look like, even with new construction. What is most important for us? Like what's the primary consideration? Great rooms, tall ceilings, kitchen overlooking a lake, common areas, loft space, and all that. And then what comes next? Are the bedrooms, are they almost like a suite? Each bedroom is a suite unto itself, or are they smaller? Are they more discreet? Can we separate the space with breezeways and other devices to break down the scale of the architecture? So there's a little bit of exploration with this project. There's more than might meet the eye to it.
That's very interesting. So a couple of things that I wanted to ask you, James. Folks that are watching this, you can go to lakesidearchitecture.ca to see these the pictures from all of these case examples. The dock that goes out onto that stone and then out a little bit more, that seems like something that you wouldn't be able to build under current regulations. Do I have that right? Is that part of what was grandfathered into this house?
That's correct. That's the case. A lot of the time that is the case. And it gets more complex on Georgian Bay because the water level has dropped down. So there's an established lake level for every lake, and usually it's geodetic. It's based on elevation above sea level is usually the way to do it. But sometimes they'll dot it on a municipal plan or on GIS mapping and all that. And you can look at it and go online and determine where you think you're going to build things. But at the end of the day, there are some heavy considerations on where and how to build. And this is what I ask listeners to do. When we're looking at this, I'd like them to take away, like, not the visuals on this or any particular project, but some basic ideas that they can apply to their own projects. So the takeaway here could be, if you wanted to build on your site and you had some constraints and conflicting constraints, would you consider breaking your floor plan apart a little bit and almost considering each major area like its own little mini cottage or pavilion? Because this is a great solution when you don't know that little bit of rock there. Like, can we put a gazebo on it? Can we put a boathouse out on the lake there? Can we have a study? Can we have a studio? What can we put there? What can we do on the land on your particular lake? Not Georgian Bay or any particular location, your particular lake. Can we use the floor plan? Can we spread it out and make it very customized to your property, turning, rotating the floor plan, putting it on different levels on the site, having breezeways, walkways? Can we work in the site with that way? Can we create those sheltered outdoor areas with our structure? Can we protect you more from the wind and the sun? That's for the level that I think where the opportunity is, John, and I hope it translates through the project that there is an opportunity not to be blocked by building constraints and site constraints, but really working closely, thinking three-dimensionally on the site, and how can we get creative with things but based on the listener's own personal requirements.
Well, and I suppose first you got to know what your dream is. Lakeside Architecture offers a design your dream home guide that helps clients understand what that dream is, and it offers some prompting questions on how to bring that dream and turn it into a reality. Do you want to help our audience and tell a little bit about what this Design Your Dream Home guide can do?
I've done projects in all over the province, but primarily they're on the Canadian Shield. We're always on the water, and there's always various challenges that we can work with. I'm there to guide and to shape a client's vision through visits on the site, working in 3D modeling, working with clients online to, in live time, model their ideas. But I need clarity on how they're going to use their structure, what their aesthetic preferences are, because the clients, John, they're the experts on the site. They know what works, and at the end of the day, if they feel that something is right for them, they're correct on it, and we're going to try to develop it. But the best way to communicate those ideas with me, and early on, is to grab the PDF and to start the process. I really emphasize that it's a process. No architect or designer has the silver bullet that once it's fired, it produces this perfect project. That doesn't exist. But what exists is a patient and thoughtful search and discovery of what works on the site. There is a solution out there, but it's great if we can sit down, get the client's ideas, and then see what I've learned from my projects and what I've seen on the site and what people are doing on the lakes to reimagine the future of their project.
So based on your expertise, you've developed this PDF, this questionnaire to help extract from the clients what their vision is. This tool helps them communicate that to you so you can bring their dream home to life. Whether they're renovating or building a new home or lakeside cottage, that is a useful tool. So folks can check that out, lakesidearchitecture.ca. The link is in the show notes. And thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Build the Unbuildable, a podcast about building high-end homes in impossible places. If you've made it this far, please give the show a like, a review, and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the listeners. I appreciate the support over the years. We've been at trade shows. We've done public presentations. We wanted to raise the awareness of good architecture, and we love speaking with great clients. Please check out the website and give me a call. I'm either on site or in the studio. I'm easy to get a hold of to talk about your project. Thank you.